We have finished the beautiful 2025th year and moved on to an even better 2026, with which I congratulate you. On the one hand, the year 2025 was really quite difficult in terms of work. But, on the other hand, if you expand your horizons and look at the situation in general, then it was, well, for me personally, the best in my life, for example. Because all the plans that were planned for 25th year came true. I hope it's the same with you. If suddenly something did not come true for someone, then 2026 will certainly be the best year in your life. And now we move on to our webinar today. Our webinar consists of several parts as always. The first topic will cover virtual machine detection and the free version of Anti-Detect 5 Exam Edition, an update of which was published today on detect.expert and is available for download absolutely free without registration or SMS. The second part will be more difficult. The second part will tell us about the problems that we have to deal with now if we want to continue working in the field of multi-accounting. And to begin with, I would like to tell you a small opus. Sometimes some users accuse me of exaggerating and, for example, telling some horror stories. And I've been conducting webinars for 10 and a half years, and in fact, every 6 months I come across this. But I want to take you back a little to the past. 2015. Few people even knew that there is a concept of a canvas fingerprint. Then, in 2015, all personality change was based on only two principles. The first principle is to change the IP address, the second is to change the user agent. That's it. In fact, for 2015, this was enough, and I clearly remember, having mentioned it many times, an interesting Firefox extension. We were all working on Firefox at the time, because Firefox of course had extensions, and I think Chrome didn't have them at all, or were very limited at all. Now, Firefox had a great extension called Anonymox. Anonymox allowed you to effortlessly download a list of PayPal accounts from some forum, then load another web resource called UnitPay. Well, no, maybe I'm wrong now, it even still exists, but UnitPay is a major payment system, and it's a Russian payment system that accepted PayPal. And with this regular Anonymox extension, which is completely free, it also had IP addresses, you could change it directly in your browser. So, and from this extension, you could quite calmly drive a stick into your web resource without any problems on your web resource on which this payment merchant, UnitPay, well, something like that, can be found on the internet. And then withdraw it to WebMoney. Moreover, the whole process took only 2 or 3 hours from making a payment to withdrawing to WebMoney. This is a magnificent 2015th year. But in 2015, I said that there was such a bullshit called WebRTC. There's this kind of bullshit called WebGL. And in fact, people completely ignored it. But now you won't find a person in our society who doesn't know what WebRTC is, or WebGL, and so on. In 2017, I was talking about the imprint of audio. Again, everyone scored, then after a while they returned. Why am I saying this? I say this because my task is not to exaggerate, but to draw your attention to the incipient problem. And this is much easier than treating the consequences of this problem later. Then, when you, figuratively speaking, your work will completely stop. And in our case, there's no, I'm lying, not one, 2 big pluses. The first big plus, not a single technology in multi-accounting or anti-fraud systems appears out of nowhere. There can be no such day, it does not exist, that for example, yesterday, this technology did not exist, and suddenly, out of nowhere, some new feature appeared and it immediately began to work. No. And if we take a cross-section of the same audio fingerprint, for example, which has absolutely nothing to do with audio, this audio fingerprint appeared in 2015 and started working in 2018. It took him 3 years to get into production normally. If we take the same TPM chip, which will be the second part of my webinar today, it appeared in the 127 version of Chrome, but only started working in the 140 version. And therefore, those topics that I want to cover in my webinars, they await you in the future with a guarantee of almost 100%. So open our ears and move on to our first topic. I really like the first theme. I like it because it was with this theme that the creation of my anti-detect began. This is a change in our personality inside the computer itself, not inside the browser, but inside the computer. Protection of a virtual machine from detection. And again, I will return you a small excursion into history. Back in 2017, when anti-detect appeared on the basis of virtual machines, ER, it was practically the first anti-detect at that time, the first full cycle, but not the first on virtual machines. At that time, there was also a project called VirtualBox Hardened. I introduced this project to users on my YouTube channel. And by the way, it was before the new year, 2017. The VirtualBox Hardened project was a small but very technological, we must give it its due patch for VirtualBox. And this project avoided a lot of detections, a virtual machine as a virtual machine, but unfortunately it was architecturally limited. It used some pretty dirty tricks like booting and vulnerable drivers like Tsugumi, like a driver that still works, and allowed drivers to be used without a signature. Well, to be honest, it was incredibly high-tech at the time. Of course, if you look at this project now, you can't call it anything but garbage. But, nevertheless, I treat it with great love and respect since a lot began with this project. But in 2017, Anti-Detect was launched, and the first goal of Anti-Detect was not to remove browser fingerprints, not to change them in any way, but to change the method of detecting a virtual machine, or rather, to hide the use of a virtual machine. Because at that time, it was actually enough to work from any browser at all, from which you want. That is, even at that time, we did not need to bother with any super serious technologies, metrics, entropy, and so on. All I needed was a new virtual machine. And I know that a lot of users who are even present here now at the webinar, and we have users of personal versions. In fact, probably I would say this, 30% of the users that we have now are users who have come to us since 2018, because it was in 2018 that they began Anti-Detect sales. So they probably remember what Anti-Detect looked like then. That is, it was a purely virtual machine, all other actions had to be done manually. Of course, it cannot be compared with what we have now, but nevertheless, the methods that worked in 2017, they partially continue to work now. And let's analyze the most basic of them and analyze how to get rid of them and what they depend on. In general, I will say this, and although some people criticize me for my words, but nevertheless, my opinion is unchanged. I can think of 10,000 ways to detect a virtual machine. And moreover, I will tell you, it is almost impossible to hide a virtual machine completely. Why do I say practically? Because we are still limited to certain hypervisors in which we work. Whether it's VirtualBox, VMware, QEMU, Proxmox for example, or Hyper-V, but we don't consider it. I'm not going to talk about some exotic hypervisors that are mainly aimed at Linux systems. Therefore, I will tell you why I chose VirtualBox and not, for example, the same VMware. and how VirtualBox is much better at bypassing detections than any other hypervisor. The fact is that VirtualBox has two editions of the main ones. Well, there are three of them, but the two main ones that are available to us. The first edition is a closed source edition, the one that we can download from the VirtualBox website. The second edition is the open source VirtualBox OSE. Again, we can download the open source code from the VirtualBox website. The problem is that they use the CCM compiler, which is 1.5 people in the world, and I'm about half of that. So, alas, the project of course is cool, but nevertheless it is not devoid of its architectural archaic features. After all, in fact, this KMK compiler, it appeared in the first version of VirtualBox, if I'm not mistaken. It's 2008 or 2009, since then it has remained so. The second project that many of you are probably familiar with is the VMware project. For many, this project is top-notch, because it is really cool. If you compare it with VirtualBox, it's much better in terms of usability and stability, because, well, we have to give credit where credit is due. VirtualBox is still a buggy project. And, as a person who works with him, I want to say the following. That's when we had the transition to the new VirtualBox version 7 codebase. Well, approximately, I'll say this, maybe 80–85% of everything that was done on anti-detect was, for my part, Oracle bug fixes. That is, it feels like the project was outsourced to one of the countries of Southeast Asia. I will not say what it is, but nevertheless, the quality of course suffered. VMware doesn't have that, but VMware doesn't either. The most important features are open source. After all, VirtualBox OSE gives us the ability to completely change everything we want. And this is a key feature of creating a real virtual machine that can bypass any kind of detectors. Anti-cheats, any proctoring systems, a bank client, or systems that we will get acquainted with today based on user authentication using his digital passport. So, VMware is a closed source system, so there are, of course, more or less such, not exactly sane, but just more or less architecturally correct patches for VMware. Some dealers try to sell them, but in fact, these patches for the most part change only two things. The first thing is the configuration file of the virtual machine, and the second thing is the registry. That is, all they do is automate manual actions. Therefore, if there were more or less some intelligible analog, of course you would have heard of it. But we're settling on VirtualBox, and its open source code is imperative to parse and study if we want to modify our system. So, here are the basic, simplest, and most popular methods for calculating virtual machines. We will get acquainted with the most popular and some quite interesting ones now, so you cannot enlarge what you see on the screen, but just listen to me, I will tell you everything. So, there are quite a lot of methods, and moreover, these methods can be invented independently without any difficulties. That is, you analyze a virtual machine, that is, you install it for yourself, analyze it, look at it, and suddenly you come up with an idea. Cool. For example, you can make a detection using the timing of the response to the request to the North Bridge. After all, on a real computer it takes only 2 and 3 seconds to access the North Bridge, while in a virtual machine it takes, for example, 5 seconds. Of course, I'm exaggerating this, but nevertheless there is such a possibility. And what do you think? There are laboratory tests and there are practical tests, and they do not always coincide. A hell of a lot of lab tests can be, but if these lab tests make it into a practical product, unfortunately, that product may not run even on 80% of real computers. because, as we all understand, everyone's computer is configured differently. In some cases, users use some kind of Frankensteins. Figuratively speaking, use an old motherboard, for example, with a more or less new video card, or try to somehow overclock something. Well, there are a huge number of variations, and it is the stability of detectors that is key in defining virtual machines. Therefore, to my dictum that it is possible to make 10,000 detectors, I would like to add that out of these 10,000 detectors, 20, 30 maybe will get into production, and the rest will be discarded because they will not be functional as such. That is, yes, they will detect a virtual machine, but at the same time, false positive will also be observed on real machines. Therefore, what do we come to? A small conclusion about virtual machine detectors. Any person of you, for example, can now write a test that will detect virtual machines from vector T13, post it on GitHub, call it anti-vector, for example, and accordingly, thus gather a small audience that will "Oh yes, cool, fuck, we started detecting vector. Oh fuck." So, well, basically, uniting with these brothers in mind, here it will be possible to have fun. Well, that's all in fact. Nothing will go further. Why? Because, as I said earlier, in most cases, if you run these tests on high entropy, that is on a large number of different real machines, you will see the following pattern. That a huge number of false positive results will be, and, worked out on real cars. Therefore, we will focus on the very top, on the most powerful detectors that currently exist in anti-cheats proctoring systems and virtual machine protection systems. Let's break down their categories. How can I install a virtual machine? Our favorite method is the registry method. Even though the method is incredibly dumb, but still, it is the most popular of all because it is very simple and it is very easy for users to understand. That is, very well and very simply, when you go to the registry, you start, for example, to look for VirtualBox there. Find a VirtualBox word, change it from VirtualBox, for example, to some ACES, and you have a detection. Super, cool, great! This is the simplest and most understandable for all users. Method of modifying the registry of files. Since every virtual machine is very focused on this when it starts, every virtual machine that exists in the world, except for the virtual machine from vector T13, was created not to bypass detections, not to hide. It was created for specific purposes. Emulation, for example, of some software, emulation of old operating systems, working in some cases with malicious software. But in no way do I know of any of them that it was specifically created by the developers in order to hide. If you know one, you can tell us about it in the comments to this video or in the chat. And I say right away, the COOPS system is not to be remembered. This is a completely different system, and it has nothing to do with multi-accounting, it has to do with anonymity. The second type of detection is hardware. And in this case, I would highlight the most important thing that is in the hardware, the so-called PCI configuration space detections. That is, in other words, vendor ID and device ID. The simplest, we have every piece of hardware in our computer. Well, pretty much everyone has unique identifiers like vendor ID and device ID, i.e. who made that device and actually the model of that device. It is the device ID and vendor ID that are used to install drivers or check compatibility. This is the most basic thing there is. In addition, the hardware, of course, also includes the identifiers of our processor, because if you don't know, just in case, I'll remind you. Our processor is like a certain tree. a small tree, and this tree, this flower, you can call it that, consists of certain leaves and certain features. And thanks to reading the parameters of these leaves, it is possible to identify the device itself. But there is one myth here that I would like to tell you about right away. And this myth is on my slide. CPU ID analysis. So, the CPU ID, a unique identifier of the processor, is not found in all processors. You can test it yourself on your client devices, and you'll see that in some cases it's even disabled in your EFI. And so I need to tell you something about the processor. In fact, the processor may be impersonal, that is, it may not have any unique identifier of its own, although this is practically, one might say, probably one of the most important components of our computer, but nevertheless, it may not have such identifiers. It all depends on its settings on the user's side, as well as on the hardware settings of the manufacturer. Because, I repeat, for example, more precisely, not its settings, but the settings of the motherboard, I apologize. Because, for example, on the device I use, CPU ID is disabled in EFI and it is disabled there by default. So if you pay attention to your CPU ID, many users may not find it. Well, parameters like MAC address, for example. By the way, the MAC address is a very interesting parameter in terms of history, because it used to be when Adobe Flash technology was used, remember, probably even YouTube, until 2017 or 2018 used Adobe Flash technology. So, with the help of Adobe Flash technology, it was really possible to get the MAC address, network device, MAC address of the network card of the computer. But at the moment, there are no such technologies, and therefore the MAC address is absolutely sovereign and impregnable. That is, it cannot be obtained from the browser. But of course, if you're using local software, there's one more important point. A MAC address cannot exist on its own, it cannot be alone. There is always a second MAC address. This is the MAC address of the network device you are communicating with. In other words, I will tell you simply. Your computer has your network card, it has its own MAC address. If you change it, it won't change a fuck at all. Why? Because you have your router, and thanks to the OS model of your network card and your network router, they establish a connection and exchange these MAC addresses for the appropriate traffic routing. Therefore, if you change the MAC address, you need to change it along with the MAC address on your router. And in no case should this be confused with the MAC address that the router itself offers you to change after you have brought it from the ISP. These are two completely different MACs. Next, our next category, let's say, is time and instructions. This is a very harmful point, which some users still do not understand. RTDSC, real-time stamp counter. So what is it? Our processor has cores. Probably this is not a secret for you. And these cores have microcycle counters. These microcycle counters are started and running from the moment the core becomes active. And there is an interesting point. If, for example, we measure the number of microcycles over a period of 1 second, for example, we made several queries in just 1 second, and we got the results of a microcycle counter for each of our cores. Then we can initiate a procedure that will be high cost, let's say. This procedure is called VM exit. You don't need to bother and go too far into what I'm saying now. Oh, then take a look. If you're interested in something, you'll need this information. So, our favorite puffish, for example, the old test is probably one of the first to appear. He was using real-time stamp counter technology to determine the use of a virtual machine. Thanks to the fact that he forced the virtual machine to execute the VM exit procedure, and the number of microcycles then grew in arithmetic progression. Accordingly, in this way, he allegedly determined the use of a virtual machine. In fact, here I would like to say that this technique A has a very large number of false positive results. For what reason? The thing is, if you have some toleristic green program on your computer, such as save electricity, take care of the planet, and some other bullshit, your computer won't run all the cores at once, and it can run them, let's say, one at a time. Well, I'm exaggerating. Now, of course, architecturally it looks a little different, but in order to convey information to you as much as possible, I will tell you in such a stupid language. So, accordingly, such a discrepancy in the microcycle counter between the cores can provoke this false positive result. We can continue the polemics even further here, talk about how important it is, how unimportant it is. We will forget about this now because for many users such complex machinery is a dark forest and there is no need to focus on it, let's say. But the last point is incredibly important for us, and we will talk about it today. And if you look at a detection method called kernel and drivers, the difficulty of bypassing it is extreme. This is the most powerful method of detecting a virtual machine that can only exist. The fact is that we have the so-called kernel in our operating system. Probably, relatively speaking, you have a rough idea of what it is. That is, it's the brain of our virtual machine, the brain of our operating system, which controls absolutely everything. And in this core, information is not subject to change in any way. Moreover, for example, the Windows operating system, it protects its kernel very strongly. It will not give you any access to this kernel. And the simplest example that I would like to tell you is the driver signature protection system, for example. That is, you can't create a driver and install it in your operating system just like that without enabling test mode. Why? Because the security systems that are embedded in the core of the operating system will not allow you to do this. First of all, because of security, since operating systems, they are just like virtual machines, they are not built to help us. That is, we always adapt those elements and tools that were not originally intended for us. Kernel and driver are the hardest because if in the context of a driver, for example, you need to get its signature in order to make it work, and that's actually force majeure for many users. The core is incomprehensible how it works, incredibly complex, some hooks, hacks, dicks. It works completely incomprehensibly. In fact, it is better to just throw away the computer and take a new one. Well, this is the logic of most users. Of course, I say right away that in my case, even in the free version, it's all fixed and you can use it without any problems. But to understand how it works, I will tell you now. In fact, in addition to detection techniques, we have different goals. And even those users who are currently watching this webinar are different from each other. Since some need to work with banks, others need to work with some kind of proctoring systems. And the proctoring system, for example, although I don't really like this word, these are online exam systems, for example. And of course, we cannot discard the category of users, which is the most numerous. These are anti-cheats, right? That is our favorite gamers. And probably the most difficult category, because there are a lot of words and little action, let's call it that. Nevertheless, anti-cheats, remember once and for all, are the most difficult technology to circumvent because they are concentrated on working with the kernel of our operating system. If in other cases, for example, a proctoring system, they can, or let's say, do not pay attention to it. Why? Because they absolutely do not need it. They, figuratively speaking, have 20 or 30 methods for detecting a virtual machine, and they are completely satisfied with it according to their own statistics. Then anti-cheats. They always deal with a huge number of users. Do you understand how many players in the world want to get certain advantages over other players, and how many people want to take the online exam? Well, I think there is a difference, maybe 100 times. Therefore, of course, anti-cheat systems are the most advanced at the moment in the field of virtual machine detection. And if we look at, again, some of the most popular techniques that anti-cheats use, the first technique would be the CPU ID technique, but not to be confused with the identifier. In the CPU ID, that is, in the list of our processor, all virtual machines have a specific bit that allows us to determine the presence of a hypervisor. And this bit, was laid down by the developers on purpose. And moreover, I will say, a lot of developers, not many, all developers make a huge number of bookmarks inside their product. In some cases, in order to, let's say, cheat. In other cases, because they don't even know how it works. Yes, don't laugh. Read the comments in the VirtualBox source code. You'll be surprised at how many to-do there are. Well, a four-letter word. TODO. You can see and understand how many, if you read the comments, technologies that are incomprehensible, even to them. So, the CPU ID, it is the bit of the presence of the hypervisor that is the simplest bit, which indicates the presence of a virtual machine. It is quite simple to change, and in the context of, for example, even a standard VirtualBox, it is possible to change the CPU ID by working with the console. In other hypervisors, it is impossible to change it in some hypervisors. The best method, of course, is to completely recreate the processor profiles and change the bit in question. I'll be brief, I won't stretch our webinar for too long, and I'll do less water, let's put it this way. The second method is just VMware backdoor. And you will almost fix this. What is the explanation for this? This is explained by the fact that, for example, there is a certain backdoor in the VMware hypervisor, which is put there by its own developers, and when you access a certain port, port 56, 58, the use of the virtual machine will be determined. And in this case, let's say any method of protection with the help of a firewall will not be enough, because here it goes a little lower than the usual Windows firewall. Therefore, a simple example of how developers initially put some backdoors into their software so that this software can be defined as a virtual machine. Well, of course, you can't get away from our favorite graphics card. In fact, I suffered a lot with the video card, of course, with the VirtualBox, and there are really and still a lot of problems with it. The amount of work that has been done is an incredible amount of work, a volume from the point of view of engineering. From the point of view of engineering, this is a masterpiece. But what is now present in Anti-Detect is definitely a technical masterpiece. And it's super, so he praised himself. Here, but of course, it is quite difficult to play some powerful games, because in this case, we will have to flip the graphics card with the help of the Juice project. For those who are interested, you can watch the video on my YouTube channel. However, I also want to mention that in my rare free time, I modified the Juice process to run more conveniently from a local device. And in principle, the same Cyberpunk turns out to be played without lags at all. here, but again, it requires a lot of manual configuration, and if you release it to production now, there will only be problems and negativity on the part of users. Therefore, I will try to finish it somehow, maybe in 3 months, in 6 months. And it is quite possible that anti-detect will be able to use games. So far, this is not relevant, since our main field of activity is corporate clients and client banks, finance. But the virtual video card itself, which is inside the virtual machine, it carries a huge number of detectors. A simple example. The amount of memory, the presence of a bus, the presence of cooling, and the same frame buffer, well, or the so-called capabilities caps, that is, the capabilities of our video card. By the way, looking ahead, I want to say a few words about WebGPU. The Anti-Detect 5 Exam Edition, which is already on the detect.expert website, already has full WebGPU support. That is, you don't need to, as we did before. Remember, you run Chrome and it says at the top, you are using an unsupported flag and so on. And of course, full WebGPU support will be available in all types of personal versions and in the Patreon version. The Patreon version will be released tomorrow. Personal core versions are released today. But remember my words now. There is one more slippery point, which I will tell you about a little later, in the second topic of our today's webinar. Because you may not want to receive today's update. So, let's move on. Our graphics card is a set of different metrics that can be used to determine the usage of a virtual machine. And it doesn't matter, even if we take some projects with a video card flash, such as, for example, Proxmox, as an option, or the same VirtualBox on Linux, where there is a PCI pass-through option. They are generally an unsolvable question about changing the video card. Why? Because the PCI pass-through procedure is first incredibly resource-intensive, that is, not resource-intensive, I'll choose another word, hardware-dependent. Because not every motherboard is capable of using this procedure. But also, among other things, the use of the PCI pass-through procedure is perfectly detected from within the virtual machine and is not subject to change as such. Why? Because this, well, figuratively speaking, you have another processor in your video, in your virtual machine. Well, you can't take and throw your processor out of the virtual machine, it will stop working for you. Likewise, you can't kick this PCI pass-through procedure out of your virtual machine because your graphics card will stop working. So, for those who dreamed of rosy elephants, thinking that adding GPUs to a VM via PCI pass-through would make everything great, I have to disappoint you. Alas, it will be even worse than using a virtual machine, a virtual graphics card. Our next procedure that we have is the monitor and ports. Even though it may seem silly, but nevertheless, no virtual machine other than the Vector T13 virtual machine exists at the moment that it has ports. That is, ports like HDMI. Ports such as those where fans are connected, for example. That is, figuratively speaking, a fan port, such ports as the same Thunderbird, for example, and all the others. In fact, they are completely absent in virtual machines, and this is an excellent method of detecting a virtual machine. And I would also like to add monitor. Quite a stupid parameter, right? The presence of a monitor, it seems that you go to the device manager. There is some kind of monitor. But here's a trick. The trick is the abbreviation EUID. You can see it on the left side of the slide. The EUID abbreviation is a base 64 encoded code that stores complete information about the monitor, its capabilities, supported extensions, color profiles, refresh rate, and so on. All VMs don't have this. And moreover, I must admit that the EUID system existed in the 4th version of anti-detect, but then it did not migrate to the 5th version of anti-detect. So, if there is a user among us under the nickname Target from our Patreon chat, a lot of respect to you for drawing my attention to this problem, and I promptly fixed it. So thank you very much again, and I hope that all users will be as knowledgeable as the target user, because he tells a lot of interesting information in masses. Indeed, a lot of interesting information for my self-education learns, and also leads me to clever thoughts. So, target, big respect. The absence of a parameter like UID, or let's say a matrix or set, is also a clear sign of virtual machine use. Let's move on. Would you have heard what NVRAM is, or EFI variables, for example? So BIOS. Surely you are familiar with this, such an abbreviation. Its more or less new version is not the BIOS already coming, but EFI or UEFI. UEFI is the bootloader of our computer, and there are a huge number of detectors in this bootloader. I would say that if I were to analyze these 10,000 detectors that I was talking about initially, I would say that 20% of them are concentrated in the EFI of our virtual machine, since this is the platform that runs all our hardware and operating system. And of course, there are many factors that can be used to determine that a virtual machine is being used. In particular, I won't even delve into secure boot, which is written here, but platform key. Notice the right side of the slide, where we have two rectangles in green and red. Platform key. What's it? EFI, which is real, it has within it the keys to start that correspond to the hardware manufacturer. That is, they can correspond to Intel, Microsoft, for example AMD, and in a real computer there can be from 5 to 11 of them. Don't ask where 11 came from, because I found this information purely in the UEFI specification and have never actually seen it. For example, there are 8 different keys on my physical computer. Do you know how many of these keys are in a virtual machine? 1, owned by the manufacturer, or VirtualBox or VMware. Where can I get these keys? These keys must, in good measure, be stolen. You need to steal them from real hardware, then compile your EFI, put them there, and then check how these keys will be validated inside the virtual machine itself. I'm saying this not to scare you, but to explain the complexity ordinary users face when trying to bypass, say, anti-cheat. But it's simple. You can request these platform keys from PowerShell yourself without using any software. By the way, I would like to draw your attention to this. Unfortunately, we are all currently under the influence of language models such as ChatGPT, Gemini, Grok, and so on. You can, in principle, screenshot any of the rectangles shown here. I've deliberately broken them down this way for your convenience and ask, for example, ChatGPT to write the code for you to check it on your actual computer. Here, but pay attention now to these platform keys. This is also a very important point that will be associated with the current update. Let's move on. Remember, EFI, that is, the crap that loads our hardware and our operating system, is incredibly important in terms of protecting against virtual machine detection. It is not so important in terms of, for example, multi-accounting, but nevertheless, we must talk about it. Burns the virtual machine with 100% probability. Our next topic is the timing of the attack. Attack timings, I mentioned them today, and now I'll just briefly touch upon them, as it's a truly complex mechanism. You need to understand how all this shit works. If you don't really understand, then it will all be in vain. I'll just tell you again. Our cores have microcycle counters. These can be made to miscount, yielding bad values. This is almost impossible on an ideal computer setup, but easily achievable on configurations with an active power saving mode, green mode, etc. This is a very similar kind of false positive attack. Laptops are susceptible. On desktop PCs, this is less common, but nevertheless, it happens. It also happens quite often if the computer is overclocked, because then microcycle counters can behave abnormally. Therefore, just remember that there are microcycle counters. When they compare A minus B equal to C, you can calculate a virtual machine from a certain share with a certain degree of probability. I would say this: if we compare it with the previous EFI-based detector, which is 100%, then the detection based on real-time stop counter is, well, let's say 50%, maybe just 50%. By the way, if you compare it with the same video card, for example, I would call it that, percent, it's even difficult, probably under 100. In fact, if you compare it with EDID and ports, which are 100% too, then you see our, unfortunately, RTDSC, it's not that cool. But nevertheless, we have it. And some proctoring and anti-cheat systems use it. And the last, the most important bullshit you can think of, and that's going to work right now, and that's going to fuck our brains for many, many years to come. Meet TPM. This is the kind of crap called Trusted Platform Module. That is, even from the name it is possible, it will be clear that for some reason it is trusted because it is a trusted platform module. In fact, this is like our digital passport. What is it? Imagine your motherboard. First, let's not start with the motherboard, but with the fact that there are three main types of TPM chips. The first type is the one built into the processor, your physical CPU. The second type is the type that's built into your video, into your motherboard, I'm sorry. The third type is the removable type. That is, you can like a bar of RAM, although it is small, but the principle is the same. You can pull it out of your motherboard and accordingly install a new one, for example. These are the three main types. There is also a fourth type. This is the type, of course, which is inside virtual machines, but we are not considering it yet. So, the TPM module is incredibly important crap now for those who are engaged in games, and for those who are engaged in banks, and for those who are engaged in ordering dildocs from Amazon. Now this crap is important for everyone. Why? Your first encounter with this type, this product, this chip was likely back in the distant 2000. Who the hell knows what year? 2020, I think, right? When we tried to install Windows 11, and Windows 11 was not installed. Why? Because he needed this TPM chip. So, by default, Windows 11 always wanted the device it ran on to be trusted, meaning that chip had to be present. This chip is small, well, about the same as in the screenshot, even smaller, I would say, about half as small. a small, rather slow chip that manages our device's encryption. That is, in fact, it is like our virtual safe. This vault has two main identifiers. The first identifier is the private key, the second identifier is the public key. The system is quite similar to the one we use, for example, in OpenVPN for encryption. Private key, public key, or PGP. Does anyone remember what PGP is? Did you catch this or don't use it at all? PGP is a private key, a public key. So, when a chip A is released from the factory, a private key is created, and it is only inside the chip and does not leave it. And this private key is also signed using the manufacturer's certificate. That is, figuratively speaking, it is signed by Intel, conditionally. The public key, it is available, that is, it is in a separate vault in the TPM, and it can be queried by any software. And here comes one very interesting thing. The fact is that our key and the public key is itself already an identifier, and an identifier that in fact is not subject to any substitution. Just imagine, that is, we can replace the video card, processor, we can replace the devil of the vault, but we cannot replace this identifier normally. Why? Because if, for example, we declare that we have a public key, let's put it simply, there, from 1 to 20, of course, it is not like that, but just abstract. We declare that we have a public key from 1 to 20. Further, any counterparty, meaning the one who interacts with us and requested this key, will then want to verify if this key is indeed correct. It will encrypt the message with the public key, which we will need to decrypt with our private key in due course. And accordingly, if we just want to replace the public key, we won't be able to do a damn thing, because our private key will not be able to decrypt the message that comes to it. And therefore, the procedure of the so-called handshake, it will not succeed. Of course, there are a few specific hacks that need to be talked about after all, because it's not for nothing that I spent so much time on this, and it's not for nothing that I'm telling you about this fucking TPM. In fact, there is a more cunning possibility. It is possible to create a virtual couple. Private key and public key. And if you emulate the device correctly emulate the KP chip itself, then in this case you can achieve a competent response from our chip, for example, to the same Chrome browser or any other anti-cheat. But there is another important point that will not allow it to work so easily. Because, it would seem, one could write their own device without any problems and solve this big headache that Vector has been talking about for 40 minutes. In fact, among other things, there is also such crap that is called a certificate, and a certificate leads to certification. I'll show you what it looks like now. Pay attention now to your screen. At the bottom, look, here is the status, certification is ready. So, by the way, you can go on your computer and check. Just type TPM in English into the Windows search bar, it will immediately take you to Windows Security, and, accordingly, Security Processor Details. So, if your system has an attestation status, for example, not ready or failed, then it will be almost impossible to pass any anti-cheats or pass the same Chrome. Why? Because if there is no attestation, and the attestation takes place from the side of the operating system kernel, then the chip is not trusted. That is, figuratively speaking, as if, imagine, you have a safe and you want to trust this safe. But you don't know a damn thing about safes? You have invited a safe master. The safe master came, looked at it and said, "Your safe is shit. In fact, this is what happens. Therefore, no one will trust a safe that is leaky." So pay attention to this inscription. But still, as for working with software, I will tell you later what interesting features there are. So our TPM is now used in all major anti-cheats, such as the same Valorant that we talked about today and a few online games. To be honest, I don't remember them from memory. With the letter T, something like Counter-Strike, some kind of bullshit. Honestly, I don't remember. They even have a web resource so black you can download an application from there. Bull flew out of my head. Sorry, I communicate like Australopithecus. But that's not the point. The most important thing is to understand how it all works. Due to the fact that the TPM chip has a unique identifier, it can be, let's say, the cause of anti-cheat problems. Because any anti-cheat application can identify this chip, knowing full well that it is not subject to any substitution, and then, accordingly, use it to ban the user. When we get into our second part today and look at how this chip works with the Chrome browser, you'll be horrified at what a fucking fuck you and I have gotten into. But don't despair because I'm with you. And moreover, I will say that such a problem has been known since the beginning of the appearance of chip support in the Chrome browser, starting with version 127, that is, who knows when. So the code has already been prepared successfully. I'll tell you a couple of tricks on how I solved this issue and, accordingly, why you can already use this solution without any problems on your computers. Let's move on. Switch to the next slide. For instance, what you see now is our computer's attestation, specifically the certificate embedded within our chip fused into the silicon at the manufacturer. Next, proves that the TPM is a real hardware chip, not a fake. The key is unique for each chip. It can't be tampered with and can't be transferred because you can't pull the private key out of the chip. This is technically impossible to do. Well, maybe someday it will be possible, at the moment not. And, accordingly, your operating system will contact Microsoft based on this data in order to verify your identifiers and verify the certificate with which you use this chip. Everything is incredibly reliable, and no other technology that is currently present in our computers has the same degree of reliability as TPM technology. Although, in fact, there is nothing particularly difficult about it. The technology is incredibly primitive, but nevertheless, it works quite successfully. And in fact, TPM as we know it today is the end of the era of various kinds of spoofers. And in fact, it's only a matter of a year, according to my estimates, about a year until there is a complete ban of users who will not be aware of this vulnerability. By the way, I would also like to remind you, not only for online shooting game players, but also for money players. PokerStars uses TPM, but it only uses it as a check so far. GeoComply uses a TPM to authenticate the user too. WMProtect uses the TPM to authenticate the user. Integra Browser, proctoring. Who else do we have there? Respondus, the proctoring system, uses a TPM. So far, they do not yet fully impose such strict requirements on it as some anti-cheats, for example, from the same Valorant, but nevertheless, they read information from there, which is then used to identify users. Well, if we are talking about anti-cheats, what can be done? What are the options? Because it is good to announce the problem, but it is even better to solve it. And in fact, at the moment, I would single out 3 main methods with the help of which you can overcome this problem. Option 1 is to use outdated hardware, and this option may be acceptable to many users. You should not use Windows 11. Go back to Windows 10 because Windows 10 is the default. It doesn't require a TPM chip, while Windows 11 does. And accordingly, if you use Windows 11 without a TPM chip, then you will have this kind of problem. You'll encounter it from anti-cheats, client banks, and even your browser, which won't trust that you're using real hardware. So, if you want to get around the TPM problem with the least amount of bloodshed, use old hardware and use Windows 10. This is your option and your decision for the next, in some cases, maybe a couple of days, in other cases, maybe a year. Because we ourselves understand that there is quite a lot of obsolete equipment in the world, and we have to introduce any such serious ones. Or as a restriction won't always benefit the manufacturers themselves, let's just say. So this is the option for you. The second option, replacement of the physical TPM module. It seems that this option is very complicated. In fact, this option does not even provide for you to think about a soldering iron. It provides for one very simple thing. You can find the TPM chip on eBay for $30, on AliExpress for $20, on Taobao for $10, and on GearBest China you can find it for about $5. Accordingly, having spent only $100 for example, you can order 20 of these chips from the Celestial Empire. And if you have an issue with anti-cheat, you also need, I immediately want to point out, you need to look at your motherboard to see if it supports removing the TPM module. If it doesn't, you can buy a motherboard, it costs a penny, with a replaceable TPM module. And then your task is incredibly simple. You shut down your operating system, you change the TPM module, then your operating system went crazy. Why? Because the download keys have changed. But thanks to the recovery system, you can restore it without any problems and continue to use it. Thus, you can deceive both browsers and anti-cheats, client banks, and proctoring systems. This is high, the simplest option, but nevertheless requires physical intervention. That is, just pull the TPM module out of the port and put it back in. Well, as an option. Some motherboards support the use of 2 TPMs. That is, you don't even need to turn off your motherboard or change the motherboard to one that supports removable TPM modules. But here it is better for you to turn to the browser. Don't write to me, neither to me nor to the supports. It all depends on the settings of your EFI and the motherboard model. And so it's better to see if you can disable the TPM module. If the module can be disconnected, then with a high degree of probability you can install and connect a second such module. But it is better to clarify this. Well, the third option is virtualization and spoofing. Virtualization and spoofing are exactly what we are coming to and what we are striving for. Because my task is to give you the highest quality product so that it takes the least amount of time and action from you. Therefore, I will tell you how I did. I did the following. I did a certain analysis for several months or even 6 months on the system of formation and attestation of TPM keys. In anti-detect, I have 2 options for what to do. The first option In the public version, I uploaded a specific set of private and public keys that can be used for work, but their variations are limited. I will say this right away. Therefore, we have several types of anti-detect. There are 20 different keys in anti-detect exam edition. If there is such a thing, if there is a need for it, of course I will increase this number, but so far without any problems. Proctoring systems, they are primarily configured for checking and for certification checking. What if everything is okay? Okay, cool. There's no need, so to speak, to identify users, because users may access from educational institutions, so to speak, to take these exams and so on. But here the rules are different everywhere. So, in the exam version I uploaded 20 keys, in the Patreon version I will upload 20 more keys, which will be different from the keys in the exam version. Next, in the personal version of the core type, which can be downloaded from the detect.expert website, well, just by selecting the appropriate type, I will put 50 keys. And if you need to get, for example, your own unique set of keys, that is, you don't want to use the keys that other users use, then we will have to go back to the process of updating you individually. This process is completely free, you don't need to pay anything. The only thing might be a queue, but in that case, I'll do it for you like before, as we did half a year ago and earlier. I will create your personal software copy containing keys unique to you. And about the certification, an important point, right? Do not miss it. How did I bypass the certification? This is a rather slippery technical issue. I will say this. I enhanced an EFI written by Oracle to intercept requests going to the real server. And the system works as follows. Your host processor is involved there. Your host processor has a TTPM module. If you have, then the system works. If you don't have the module, well, sorry. And if you have a TPM, then the attestation process, or rather checking the operating system, will go through your host TPM. So, within the VM, we show the public-private key, while certificate validation occurs on your host. I will not disclose specific technical details, I said in general. Therefore, if there are any technicians here, I think that this will be enough for them. So, well, in general, the system works, and you can pay attention in the exam version. For example, if you go to the same page that I showed earlier, to this one, you will see that the certification status there will be ready. But this, again, is only if your host computer has a TPM chip. So anyone who wants can use this software. It can be downloaded absolutely free of charge from the detect.expert website in the software catalog section. I posted the full changelog today on the channel. Much interesting information I would like to convey, but then this webinar would have dragged on for 5 or 6 hours. And I don't think you want to listen to me for so long today. Therefore, I invite everyone who wants to use the free version of my software or who wants to use any exam services, please download the software and work with it. The only thing I would like to draw your attention to is one very important thing. Like I said, you can make 1,000, 10,000 children in a virtual machine. And there is a very important point here. Oh, I'm not saying that my software will go and overcome absolutely everything. No, what is the explanation for this? The fact is that, of course, my project is a flagship, and there is not a single project even like this, even close to it in the world. There are at most some self-written patches, and you should not pay attention to them. Therefore, of course, my project is excellent, well monitored, and I will try to keep it relevant. But nevertheless, you need to understand that if someone wants to find an antidote against him, he will find it. I say this as a developer. He will find an antidote. Accordingly, my task will then be to find again against his antidote, for his antidote, a new poison for example, and so on. Therefore, let's see how this project behaves. I am not a supporter of wasting time engaging in a game of cat and mouse when someone will oppose too seriously. And let's put it this way, well, we'll see. Therefore, while everything is working, I invite you, I will try to keep this project in good shape. And I would also like to tell you about one thing that is not exactly unpleasant, but nevertheless unpleasant for some users. Pay attention to the screenshot now. Supports are often sent this kind of screenshots by various users. Why? Because we have people in chat rooms who sell free software. In this case, on your screens is software from 2018. It didn't even have a digital signature or licensing system back then. And this software, it is posted for free, it can be found on Vietnamese sites and so on. In order to attract users, we wrote this AWASP hardware panel and wrote something like presets. But architecturally, all this is simply... And this AWASP hardware panel, it just copies what has already been done in anti-detect. She's just copying it. As for the presets, as far as I was told by users who are engaged in reverse engineering, it is just a dummy. That is, you choose a preset, it just starts a virtual machine, and that's it. That is, you can see it yourself. Who is interested in reversing, you can ask users in the chat for this software. This software is sold at a price of $300 to $600. But I'll tell you this, the free version of the exam that I showed you today, it is not even one, not two, 20 generations better than the software from 2018. By the way, pay attention to the arrow that I have drawn. This arrow points to the watermark, which is located in the lower right corner. This arrow indicates a watermark that indicates that the computer has been put into test mode. Why is it in test mode? Because, remember, once upon a time we used test mode, because we did not have a signature from Microsoft. And now you are unlikely to even go into test mode because you have the secure boot policy of your computer. It simply will not allow you to do this. And working in test mode is at the moment 2025 complete archaism. Idiocy 26, I apologize. So don't waste your time and just download the free version if you want to get acquainted with my software. But there are two more points that I would like to talk about. When you create a virtual machine, remember what I said about how the TPM works now? Note the following. I recommend using the host as the processor model in this case. Let me explain why this happens. It's not that you're going to completely throw the host computer, the host processor, inside the virtual machine. No, VirtualBox doesn't offer that. The fact that your processor will be displayed as a string parameter, for example, in system and so on, can be completely ignored. Using host mode in this case means compatibility mode, where CPU identifiers are used, specifically, leaves are spoofed from the VM side, and the functionality and performance of these spoofs are utilized from your host. Virtual machines that have host mode enabled, now I'm going to upgrade it very much, but even at the moment you can notice a huge increase in performance. That is, you won't even feel the difference between a virtual machine and just surfing between your Explorer folders. so this is just a recommendation. This is not necessary, you can set any other processor here, but I recommend using this mode. I'll explain why. Because using CPU profiles in a virtual machine, as we've used for many years, is resource intensive, and on low-end computers it can cause quite a bit of a drop in performance. And the host mode I'm using, it actually does the following. It allows us to use the engine from our host processor, while dressing it, figuratively speaking, putting a different name on it. Cool, super. And so far the results are excellent. You can try to pass any tests for the use of virtual machines. You will pass them without any problems. Anti-cheats too, by the way, try it, why not? But there is one more important point besides the processor that I want to draw your attention to. Please take a look here. RAM is an incredibly important point if you want to work with various kinds of anti-cheats or proctoring systems. Right-click on the virtual machine, go to the Anti-Detect menu, then Hardware and RAM. The fact is that I deliberately did not make an automatic output RAM bars, because until recently they were practically unnecessary. But at the moment, if you do not set the RAM bars, then this will be a sign of the lack of RAM in your computer. This will be detected by Google Chrome and any anti-cheat software or virtual machine tests. So I recommend that if you set up 8 GB of RAM, for example, for your virtual machine, give yourself either 4 sticks of 2 GB or 2 sticks of 4 or 1 of 6. That's it. 1 in 8, I'm sorry. So please pay attention to this. In the future, I'll automate the system, but currently I haven't had time. My work shift, if I can call it that, ended on the 31st at 3 p.m. and started on the 1st at 12 p.m. That is, in fact, I even had a break for the new year for less than a day, since there are a huge number of courses that I need to release and record video lessons. By the way, if there are users from the Cybercrime and Fraud Lab courses here, tomorrow you will receive an update of the lesson. The second part is to register for the sale of Microsoft accounts. So be sure to wait. The information will be cool, and this will be the final lesson on Microsoft, which will allow you to organize the entire workflow. So expect it from me tomorrow. Well, all users of personal versions, of course, will be waiting for an update today, which will be available on the detect.expert website. Well, for those who will watch this webinar in recording or who have not yet used my software, I recommend downloading this software absolutely free of charge and checking it for performance in your particular case. Well, it is always possible to improve it, and I will work on it. Well, now let's move on to our next topic. This is our final topic since we have been broadcasting for 20 hours now. What is a TPM module in the context of our work with you? How can any web resource identify you now? Want to know? You'll find out in a moment. So let's go back to a certain kind of story once again. This story will begin with the release of the 140th version of Google Chrome, which happened on the 1st or 2nd of September. Then the TPM module began to work at full speed, but this module is incredibly slow. It cannot, for example, encrypt traffic, but if it encrypts traffic, our speed will drop to, I don't know, 10 kilobits, maybe per second. He can't do it. What can he do then? It can only serve as a presence, it seems, but the presence of this module is not an identifier of any kind. But at the same time, it's a web resource, because we have privacy regulations, GDPR, all the... A web resource cannot access this TPM using our browser either. What the fuck can web resources identify us with this module? And I'll tell you, look at this abbreviation that you see now in the second paragraph. DBSC. Now that's incredibly important crap. The fact is that the Google Chrome browser and Edge in the same way, and what's more, I'll tell you, even Firefox now uses the Windows API to access our TPM chip. And do you know why? They ask him to encrypt cookies. Imagine absolutely some kind of idiocy, right? The fact is that cookies have made the transition from version B10 to version B20. And it so happened that this happened just in September 2025, when all users began to have big problems with the passage of anti-fraud systems. Even though the simplest browser check for this chip on Windows 11 would be enough, it's still just an indicator of, say, a virtual machine or a fake system. And Chrome makes it much cooler and more interesting. Device-bound session credentials. My English is not very good today. So, how does this system happen and why was it created? With a good purpose. It is an incredibly good purpose to protect our cookies so that they cannot be stolen, and even if they are stolen, so that they cannot be used on another computer. Imagine an incredible breakthrough in the field of information security, and one that actually deprives a huge number of dealers who use their botnets to steal cookies of their jobs. Yes, of course, you can still attack some Belarusian knitwear site, but the fuck they're sailed with PayPal, the fuck they're sailed with Amazon, with eBay, and with all the other systems. And why? Because this kind of procedure is taking place. Let's take a look at it now. A web resource submits a request for registration. After the initial authentication, the server sends a certain HTTP header, which contains the parameters of the algorithms, as well as the URL and endpoint of registration, that is, the URL of the web resource itself. In step number 2, our browser accesses the TPM encryption module to generate a new asymmetric key pair. A separate key pair is generated for each web resource and, moreover, for each unique domain. Because, for example, Amazon.com, Amazon AE, Amazon NZ will have completely different keys. Now, our browser generates this unique key and a unique key pair. The browser sends the public key to the server, and the server stores that key. At this stage, our identification has actually already taken place. Token issuance. Step number 4. The server issues session cookies marked as requiring proof, i.e. requiring verification on our chip. First, the web resource asked us for chip availability. The browser replied that we had a chip, used it to generate keys, and then sent the keys to the web resource. The web resource has generated a special token for us, which we need to check with our TPM chip whether it is working correctly or not. And thus, a web resource has the ability to identify us and our chip thanks to the public key stored in it. Well, you could in principle extend this topic even further using so-called short-term cookies, which operate and refresh only once every 15 minutes. If our regular cookies might last, say, a day, then in this case, every 15 minutes, during an active session, a new short-term token will be generated, allowing user identification. In other words, I have just given a lot of information. I understand that it needs to be digested, so now let me tell you all this complex machinery in simple words. Once again, the web resource asks the browser if we have a TPM module. We inform, or rather, the browser informs us by communicating with the Win API that the module exists and then sends the public key to the web resource. And here it is, a unique identifier that will identify us for this web resource. If we transfer our cookies to another computer, it will no longer be possible to identify us. Why? Because our cookies won't match the key stored in our new TPM device, decryption of such cookies will be impossible, and the web resource will initiate their reissue. What leads to what? This will raise a big red flag for the web resource, indicating that these cookies were tampered with or moved between devices, which is essentially official refusal. Here, in this scheme, there are a few more interesting points. Interesting moment number 1. If you are using Windows 11, as I said earlier, and this is passed in the user agent, and you do not have a TPM, you will automatically be, let's say, marked as an untrusted device, virtual machine, or bot traffic. If you have any forged certificate in your TPM, then it will be impossible to establish a communication session using this technology, so A, you will again be given a red flag. Thanks to the TPM module, Google allows you to identify bot traffic. Why? Because bots don't have TPMs. And at the moment, thanks to the introduction of the TPM control system, Google has been able to reduce and calculate quality, quantity, or rather, I beg your pardon, the amount of bot traffic by more than 80%. What remains is bot traffic from devices that are infected and are in botnets. So, in fact, in this way, Google destroyed a huge market of those people who were selling cookies with PayPal accounts, cookies with all kinds of accounts like Wells Fargo and things like that. Because in fact, at the moment, these files of course can be installed in your computer, but they will not work. Therefore, for now, maybe this market will still hold, because not everyone is aware of this update. Here, but in fact, I want to say that this is actually a guaranteed death, because there will be no rollback from the TPM chip, because there is not a single prerequisite for this. And looking ahead, I'd like to say that this TPM chip can actually replace most of our fingerprints, which are easily faked, but the chip itself is virtually impossible to counterfeit. There is either a technique from Vector T13, or maybe someone will invent an independent technique by patching the kernel of the operating system. Here, but nevertheless, there is such a possibility. And again, here I would like to return to this slide. How to bypass anti-cheat? In this case, let's paraphrase. How to bypass Google Chrome? The first is the use of outdated equipment, the second is the replacement of the TPM module. Well, in the case of multi-accounting, it probably won't be very interesting, although it all depends on who you're working against. If, as in the case of Microsoft, you sell an account for $300, $400, $500, well, then I think spending $3 to $5 on the same TPM chip is quite economically justified. Or maybe on the detect.expert website, you will soon find delivery of TPM chips around the world. Who knows? Or, again, back to virtualization and spoofing. But here about the virtual machine, I would like to say again, in my case, if you are going to work with an anti-fraud system that uses TPM verification, it would be better for you to request an individual update and not be on a software like Core. But I say right away, there is a certain kind, maybe a certain kind of queue, because there is no queue yet. 0 people are there. here, but nevertheless, after this webinar, this queue may well form. Well, in conclusion, I would like to say, signature horror story from Vector T13. Now imagine that our WebRTC traffic can also be used by a TPM chip. And now let's imagine a situation. Our cookies are encrypted with a TPM chip from our native PC, for example, or from our virtual machine, and WebRTC traffic is encrypted with a TPM chip which is located on the OpenVPN server on which our proxies are deployed. And there will be a completely different imprint. And thus, the web resource can determine that two different fingerprints are used, which means that a proxy system is used. Well, of course, I'm talking complete bullshit now, so you've probably already read what is found, the inscription that is at the bottom of this slide. But nevertheless, as they say, the fairy tale is a lie, and in it, bitch, a fucking hint that such bullshit can in principle turn out without any difficulties. Why can't it be in WebRTC format? Because WebRTC has certain specifications and definite, let's say, goals and objectives. To change them so radically is to change the GDPR policies, and accordingly, you can get a good kick for it. And for example, we remember that we have ORTC, Ahoy RTC, WebRTC. Who knows, maybe in just a couple of days, some RTC will appear, and the scheme that I've just told you about will work there. Well, dear friends, this is the end of our theoretical part today, and I will move on to the answers to your questions. We don't have much time left. I warned everyone that in order for me to answer your questions, it is better to ask them at the beginning of our webinar. Especially for this, I opened access to the webinar and to the chat 20 minutes before the start of our webinar. So let's move on to the answers to the questions that you asked a lot in the chat of our webinar. By the way, I would like to express my great gratitude once again, because we were at the start, a little more than that, only 200 people. Now there are already 331 of us. If 2 more people came, it would be a great number. So let's move on to our questions. The first question from Lunatic. Vector in the VPN bundle Tor VPN, how to reasonably do so that the real IP address is not leaked? And how much anonymity does Tor really provide? Yes, the question was copied twice, but that's fine. Oh, Tor gives you a great level of anonymity right now because it's the only invention right now that's really designed for anonymity. As many users get confused and say that a VPN is a means of anonymity, when, although it has never been like that, it has always been a means of security. VPN, Tor VPN, is a great solution at the moment, as long as you don't make certain mistakes in paying for the servers correctly at the time of registration. But what else would I like to say? In principle, Tor will limit you. In any case, it will act as a kind of firewall, but to be more sure, I would still disable the UDP and IPv6 protocols on your host device. Tor doesn't support the UDP protocol, so you shouldn't be afraid of this, but I would still disable it for an extra guarantee. And so, a great remedy, and I don't even know when it will cease to be relevant. Of course, you can do better. It can be even better since in Tor VPN we have a certain, well, let's say a certain bottleneck, that's the first VPN. Currently, many countries block VPNs. Of course, if you replace the VPN's inbound protocol with, for example, Hysteria 2 or Mask protocol, not to be confused with the famous billionaire, then it's possible to bypass any existing firewall. If everything is done correctly, the system is relevant. Next, also a question from the user Lunatic. In your VPN bundle, Tor VPN connection is sequential. Do I understand correctly that the first VPN that the ISP goes from the ISP sees all the traffic? It is possible to make an encapsulated connection so that the VPN cannot commit MITM. It can be done. You want, you can do it. I see no particular, let's say, no need for that. Well, again, it depends on what you work with. If you have, figuratively speaking, a currency exchange or crypto money laundering office there, then yes, it will be useful for you. And if you're doing something else, maybe it's just superfluous. Next, the next question is again from the user Lunatic. Is it possible to make a plausible denial for a Linux host, or is it possible only for Windows from VeraCrypt? The only thing you'll need to do is make sure that your disk partitioning table is GPT, not MBR, not master boot record. This is very important, otherwise on master boot, boot record on modern partitioning systems, you will not have a plausible denial technique, it completely breaks it. So it's better to take a look at your equipment first. Not all equipment is suitable for the implementation of the plausible denial method. Let's move on. Again, a question from the user Lunatic. Vector, the book by Mark Sportak, Computer Networks and Network Technologies, on 720 pages in Russian from the publication DS Soft, Kiev. Is this the book you were talking about? Yes, this is exactly the book I was talking about. Exactly. I still think it's still the best in explaining the work of the network and network technologies. Question from Lunatic. Vector, is there a future in anonymity? There is a reaction to any action, so of course, yes, the demand for anonymity will only grow. If only we had the opportunity to record this conversation now and listen to it in 10 years, although we have such an opportunity. Yes, why not? You can now check my conversations from 2015, for example, my webinars, and what I said. By the way, it all came true. That's amazing. So, Anonymous, the demand for anonymity will only increase, because the fact that we are coming to with you in the global sense, it is, well, let's say, terrible. Personally, I'm not some kind of cypherpunk or some other fan of tinfoil hats, but if a person is adequate and appreciates the fuck when they get into our ass with a camera, don't exaggerate here, it's just said, then the demand for anonymity will only grow. So learn how to organize anonymity, you can make good money on it. Question from Lunatic. Vector, is there gas in the Burj Khalifa? Gas is an archaism, and moreover, it is very dangerous in itself, so there is no gas here. Let's move on. A question from user Amy Gonzalez. Good evening, dear Dimitri. Good evening, dear Amy Gonzalez. Why do you think all companies using anti-fraud systems leave the opportunity to bypass their protection? It is clear that if a conditional bookmaker immediately requests docs upon registration, this can repel users. But why, for example, are there no mandatory docs for withdrawal? Why leave the opportunity to bypass the protection of the system and steal money? Do you think such an outcome is possible, given the constant complication of anti-fraud, or does something prevent them from taking such extreme measures? Amy Gonzalez. There is a very good thing in this case, but it needs to be understood. The thing is, you can make a cool defense system, or you can make just a good defense system, and just a good defense system will make a lot more money. Do you know why? There are two answers. First answer, it won't find fault with users so much, and users will be, let's say, better at coming with, let's put it this way. And with greater joy, with ease, they will use this system. And lightness is always good. But in addition, crime is needed, it is very necessary. If you think that the most basic task of anti-fraud systems is to overcome absolutely everyone, no, and again, no. The fact is that there is such a wonderful thing called insurance. And if there are any proven incidents, that is figuratively speaking, imagine an operation. And bitch fuck, here's a simple example for you. Do you know what I mean? That is, in some cases, you can get more money from the insurance company than you will receive even from the legal monthly turnover. This is the first thing. Secondly, implementing a workaround for this system can, let's say, increase expenses in a way that allows paying fewer taxes depending on the jurisdiction. Because not all bookmakers are registered in countries with zero taxation. And if this most successful bookmaker is wonderful, who earns $10 million a month, somehow got $20 million in damage from 1,000 fuckers, what will he pay taxes on? Agree. And it is really possible to prove that this happened without any problems. This is just a technical, let's say technical flaw. Therefore, as they used to say in the company, the film Lord of War with Nicolas Cage, I am needed. Therefore, I think I will not continue further. Next is the next question. Question from a Wall Street user. I'm with Patreon. Can you give me some settings, tips for working with multiple accounts on Amazon? Because recently accounts have a very high percentage of blocking. Amazon accounts use the same system called Google reCAPTCHA. And we have partially considered its mechanisms today, so I would recommend that you start with this system. A free checker is posted for her in the anti-detect group. You can use it and adjust your system for correct operation. In the case of Amazon, if you're based in the US, I'll tell you right away what your problem is. It's no IPv4, because I know that you don't have it. If you're working in the US and you don't have an IPv of 4, then you're in trouble. Because just recently, the US said that they have 100% of their subscribers with an IPv of 6. So I definitely recommend that you pay attention to this. Let's move on. Dimajan, it's me. Dimajan is me. He sends me a finger, but not the middle one. This is already good. Hello, David. Greetings, dear Vector T13. Hello, David. Now wait, I approved the wrong message. Sorry, I'm from Dima Bilan. Yes, from Dima Bilan. So, I'll read now from the user Dimajan, it's me. Greetings, dear Vector T13. And I greet you, David, and all who are here, those who are here. Everyone here greets you too. I wish that this year, and everyone will be strong in their business and achieve their goals with this force. It is directly you said, as I did at the beginning of our webinar today, that I am incredibly happy and the year 2025 was the best year of my life because all the goals that were set at the beginning of the year, they were all achieved. Some goals, however, were achieved a couple of days before the new year, but nevertheless, it is really cool. So I wish you the same so that everything is fine with you and you achieve your goals. And the whole chat also joins in my congratulations. We will always achieve everything together. The main thing is not to be lazy and not to piss. Let's move on. Question from Dima Bilan. Greetings, dear Vector. I ask you to analyze the issue in detail. Recently, eBay has been registering as a seller without any problems. The statistics are excellent. I use a personal camera and a router from Konon, but recently the product has stopped laying out. Reactivate arrives. Is this somehow related to TPM and other innovations from Chrome? The stuff that will be released after the webinar will solve this problem. As for this, I will immediately stop here before reading your question. Yes, the personal program that will be released now will appear on the detect.expert website today. It will solve your eBay issue. Why? Because, as I said, regarding the TPM, well, to be honest, with eBay, there are still a couple of features that are not the time to talk about now, not at this webinar, let's put it this way. So I updated these features in the software, let's put it this way. I'll explain simply now. Let me explain in a simple, really simple way. I'm going to load you a slide. How do I do that? To be honest, I don't like click meetings. Now I'm going to pull out a slide from another presentation, from a closed webinar. So Dima Balan, please look at this slide. Google has tightened the methodology for branding its software. What does this mean? Many times I recorded videos showing that the installer's checksum depends on our cookies. In other words, if you go to Google and click Download Google, you will download one file, you can check its checksum, and then if you go from an incognito browser, for example, or just clear your cookies, download the same file, it will be downloaded with a different checksum. That is, this is how Google identifies users, but unfortunately, they went even further, and I would not say that this is related to the 140th version of Chrome. I would say that is, if you started having problems, I can even roughly tell when. They began on November 23rd, 2024, because it was during this period that Google changed the branding parameters. What's it? Every piece of software every copy of Google Chrome that is downloaded to our computer, to every other computer in the world, it has certain codes to make Google understand who is in front of it. And in particular, there's corporate code, nightly code, code for some bot device, virtual machine code, and this code is then used in the X-client data transmission parameters. So, Google Chrome, or rather, Google Company, introduced mandatory branding of bot traffic when using the curl loader. This is the first thing. Second, they mandated bot traffic when downloading the Google Chrome installer from a browser whose cookies have a lifespan, an issuance period of less than 24 hours. In simple words, if you check the Install Google Chrome checkbox as before the curl downloader was used. The curl downloader has been automatically marked as bot traffic since November and accordingly did not allow you to work normally with some web resources. Again, not with everyone. We're only talking about the Google ecosystem and its accomplices here. Or if you, for example, manually installed a virtual machine, what are the user actions? He goes to Edge, goes to the Google website. Cookies have just been issued to him. Then it downloads Google Chrome. When loading Google Chrome, Google makes a correlation with client cookies and determines that the cookies were issued, relatively speaking, 10 minutes or 10 seconds ago. Cookies have never been issued on this device before. Accordingly what? Suspicious behavior. Therefore, in the new version of Anti-Detect, we use a bootloader called Bits. Bits is a built-in standard Windows downloader, and the Bits protocol is also the protocol used for official Google Chrome updates. That's it. So we don't have any more bot brands, and that will solve your question. Next, I read the second part of the question, and let's close this slide so that users do not have many questions. Let's go here. And answer honestly, what do you think? Is it possible nowadays to make a self-registration of a seller on eBay and immediately put up a product for $500 to $1,000 without restrictions using your personal account and ideal proxies, ping 5000? Or do you need a distraction, social networks and other auxiliary mechanisms? I would say that I do not consider it possible to immediately put up the goods for $500 to $1,000. I don't think it's possible, because it's too suspicious for a term with a lot of risks. So no, alas. I would say, even on my personal staff, this is hardly possible. But I'm not saying it's impossible. I say that this is hardly possible. Also like this. Next question. Question from Quanon. Just like that. Beg your pardon. It's not cocaine, it's just a runny nose. It's winter after all, 25 degrees, I'm freezing. Dima, hello again. I won't call you by your first name, so I'll call you Quanon. Why does the VM lag on new versions? That is, the work is not that it is not smooth, it slows down? On slightly older versions, this was not the case. I thought it was because of an overflowing disk, but I freed it by half, and the glitch remained. On previous versions, not the one you received today, they use a spoofing system in floating point calculations, so it can, let's say, make adjustments. But if you try the version I gave you today, you won't have any problems. The second question, why don't the minimize, maximize, exit icons be displayed in some windows, for example, system windows? I won't tell you that. To be honest, this is due to the new Windows 11 updates, and why the fuck is this going on? I don't know. I can't even find any logical explanation for this. Perhaps, in principle, this is some kind of glitch on the part of VirtualBox, but I haven't figured out what it is yet because the task is not a priority. Next, both questions are only about Win 11. Well, yes, everything is okay at Win 10. Win 10, because it does not develop in any way, does not adapt to new anti-aliasing systems, and so on. By the way, I would like to tell you here, my dear users, another very, very important point. Look, I don't always like to follow the lead of users. Of course, you are clients, and I love and respect you all, and I try to make you feel good. But sometimes this is counterproductive. What do I mean? Here are users in the English language chat complaining that what the fuck are we using video cards in anti-detect NVIDIA there, the 10th series, when there is already a fucking 40th series. I said many times, fuck, well, you don't need to. Why the fuck do you? Well, look at the Steam stats if you want to, and you'll be clear. Unfortunately, users were convinced that showing an NVIDIA RTX 4090 video card would magically make their playthrough amazing. So I would like to say, in the new personal versions, in the exam version, in Patreon, I have completely redesigned the list of all video cards. We don't use powerful graphics cards anymore. The best performance, the best bypass pass, or rather anti-fraud, on Intel graphics cards that are integrated. Well, in fact, it's just a built-in graphics card on real devices. Why? The fact is that web resources now use anti-fraud systems using metrics, performance metrics. Therefore, if we declare that we use an NVIDIA graphics card 4090 and we have a performance from an NVIDIA graphics card, for example, 980, but this will not coincide. Based on practical tests, I've established the following correlation and completely updated all GPUs in anti-detect. So I want to say right away, do not write to the supports why we have low-power video cards. I was guided by Steam statistics. Steam is still a gaming platform, not even any online stores. So, the entire list of graphics cards that are now new to anti-detect is popular. These are not some models that are forgotten and not used by anyone, but nevertheless, they fully correspond to the performance of the virtual card that anti-detect has. And the next step will be the same correlation on the part of processors. That is, we will no longer use the names of processors that have more than 6 cores. This is an incredibly important moment for passing anti-fraud. So don't make me write on a donkey that it's a quantum computer. Although, of course, we do not have a donkey, but an incredibly high-tech product, but nevertheless, performance on some computers can be very low. Next question. Question from user Capril. Vector, hello. Thank you for your kind words and feedback on the last stream. Capril, always glad. By the way, for those who don't know, the user Capril is a co-author of the anti-detect router project. And moreover, he was the one who wrote the last 2 updates for the anti-detect router project. And now the 3rd update I also saw that he released in the chat, but unfortunately I just haven't physically got to the chat yet, because I'm constantly busy with software updates, webinars or something else. Because for these literally 5, how many already? What is it like today? The 8th. In the week since the new year, there have been a huge number of updates and new features. So, user Caprel, I continue his question, answer his question. What to expect at the end of the Fraud Lab course? Will someone go on the next round or wrap up? I can't tell you a 100% clear plan, well, I just can't voice it here. Here I will say this. This is definitely not the end. We are not even at the beginning, we are probably in the embryo. Hypothetically, imagine I have a utopian plan to raise an elite squad. Can you imagine that? Well, imagine. Well, I will not tell you further because we are in the public space, so this is not even the beginning. Check the TP at your leisure. Very necessary. Sincerely, Caprel. Caprel. I promise that I will check, but I do not promise that today, because now only the webinar will end, our planned time will expire in just a few minutes. I'll go back to the anti-detect update, and at best finish it by morning with all the uses of version 9 and so on. So most likely tomorrow. I will try very hard, but I do not promise. Sorry, the personal message is overcrowded. I just don't go there anymore, because I'm scared. As many messages as there are, well, it's terrible. So the next question. Question from Dima Bilan. Vector, on the new personal computer, which will be released after the webinar, will the old virtual machines work and will they start? They won't. I will explain why. Because we have new equipment, notably. What stands out most from the new equipment is the network card, due to entirely new drivers, and the video card, also with entirely new drivers and new hardware. So no, old machines will not work. You need to take this into account. By the way, thank you. I will announce on the main channel that old virtual machines will no longer work. Another question about anti-detect on Android. When is the same anti-detect output in CLID? Thanks. Dima Bilan and I now want to call everyone here open your ears. Strange as it may seem, we have achieved incredible success, but you will never believe where. Not macOS, not Android. In Android, of course, there is success, yes, and I will talk about it now. But a completely interesting dark horse, which is now screwing anti-fraud left and right. Do you know what kind of horse it is? Chrome OS. Have you ever heard of such bullshit? To be honest, I've been parsing the Chrome source code to find updates, and yet I've heard it mentioned that there's such a thing as Chrome OS. I didn't pay much attention to it, because I understand that it is for some kind of specific devices. I don't give a shit about these devices. And here I was interested, and I decided to virtualize it. It was still, I don't know, maybe the beginning of December here, but the results are actually amazing. Therefore, anti-detect in CLID will be released along with support for Android and Chrome OS. But plus, of course, the most basic thing that will be in anti-detect in CLID is still the Windows operating system, no matter how you look at it. Here, but there is a system of redistribution of resources. What does it mean? Imagine that we now allocate 4 cores to a virtual machine, for example. These 4 cores will not run as fast as the 4 cores on the host computer. Why? Because we have costs for the virtual machine itself. Therefore, the system will work as follows. 4.5 cores, 5 cores, dynamic allocation of resources, main OS resources, CPU resources, RAM resources, and VRAM resources will be allocated. I want to make it dynamic. I don't just want to do, I'm already making this provisioning dynamic. To ensure that the virtual machine always maintains performance at the level of the hardware we specify. And in addition, of course, advanced floating point calculations are an incredibly important point, which is now one of the key points in the passage of anti-fraud. Because if any of you ever want to wonder what an audio fingerprint actually is, you'll realize that there's no audio there. The audio fingerprint is essentially your processor's fingerprint, which arises from floating point computations and can be altered by modifying these computations. And if you want to replace the canvas, Huyan was there, relatively speaking, which we are changing. That's cool, of course, but when your CPU shows your unique compute fingerprint, that's where you need to think. So about the timing, I will not announce the dates because users are very fond of bullying me. And you promised, you promised, you promised, you promised. Therefore, I do not promise anything to anyone. It will come out when it comes out. I can only say one thing. It's unlikely there will be any major updates for Anti-Detect 5 anymore. Minor upgrades, such as new processors, an automatic pickup system for processor cores, and the amount of RAM it will be. But let's put it this way. We are now waiting for a parallel update from Oracle to version 7.3, and we hope that it will happen, or there will already be a direct transition to the 8th version, which, in principle, should tentatively be in April of this year. But we'll see, let's not guess. So, and accordingly, we will notify users, because prices will increase. Now we are completely satisfied with the number of clients, but sometimes we can hardly cope. Let's put it this way. Especially before the new year, the number of customers was quite large, and many users received builds with a long delay. So it is quite possible that when Anti-Detect is released, well, not when it is released, but before the release of Anti-Detect 6 in CLID, we will raise prices. And accordingly, as soon as you see that the prices have increased, which we will warn you about, then the release of Anti-Detect in CLID will be very soon. So, just a couple more questions and we will wrap up. So, the question of the AA user. Victor, have you received any complaints from owners of AMD processors? Starting from the 5th version, the personnel began to slow down. Windows installs for half an hour and works with freezes. Is this a massive problem or did something happen to me alone? However, just above, user Kvanon wrote that he has certain difficulties with performance. But, my dear AA user, I recommend that you do 2 things. First, wait for today's release of this combined processor virtual. I think that she will solve your question, because look what the trick is most likely for you. We emulate only Intel-type processors inside the virtual machine, and it is possible that there is a mismatch between the instructions of the Intel processor and AMD processors on your AMD processor. That is, a virtual machine asks your processor for something that cannot be in it. And when it doesn't find it, it starts a software emulation of that functionality. And therefore, this is most likely the reason why you have such freezes. So the next question from a non-worker. Anti-Detect 5 exam editions probably can bypass Detect VM simple anti-fraud systems? Well, I recommend you to always try. Don't ask me, it's better to try. Right, Pablo Escobar. Good evening, Dmitro. Чи буде працювати підміна кари на Android VM? Yes, camera substitution will work in photo and video modes within the Android virtual machine. And it will also include full codec emulation. So we won't be using one codec how to explain this? The image encoding codec varies across webcams as it depends on their software. And we will have the emulation of this code in the field of the telephone, the model of the telephone. Next question. Question from a non-worker. Dimitri, why did you decide to make the exam edition free? Is this related to your attitude to the existing university system? This is due to the large number of people, specifically students, who contact support. They are in search. And if you look, well, of course, if you take the CIS market, online exams are not as high a priority there. But in the USA, well, it's just, I understand that I think every second exam is an online exam, and a huge number of users need these systems. Accordingly, what is the trick? US users are looking for a virtual machine. They heard of VMs for work, for hiding themselves. They find the Patreon version, they buy the Patreon version, which is not designed for exams in any way. It doesn't work a damn thing for them. They begin to be angry, they begin to blame me for this. Therefore, in order to stop this hotbed of, an absolutely free version was made, which is just designed to work with online exams. Kartik C? No, there will be no English today. It is a Russian-speaking webinar, but you will have an ability to watch this webinar in English in just a few days on my YouTube channel. Just take a look and pay attention on my main Telegram group and you will get the link. Alright, let's wrap this up. We've gone a bit over our allocated time today. Thank you all very much for attending this webinar. After all, 300, more than 300 people, is an excellent result. Thank you. I wish you all the best. Have a nice Saturday evening and Thursday evening. Once again, I congratulate you on the coming 2026 year and wish you all the best, the fulfillment of your plans and the implementation of everything you have planned. And I'll help you with everything else. Thank you for your attention. You had Vector T13 with you. I tried, rate it with a good review, and see you then at the next webinar. Goodbye, everyone!